Kate BYP with an explanation I've overlooked as to why things in FCC rules are like they are and why amateur radio is like it is historically, and why I make so much emphasis on something that might seem trivial, like what kind of call sign separator, such as saying stroke. Stroke is wrong. Stroke is illegal. It is effectively illegal for some amateur to say stroke on the air. Did you know that? Did you know why? Yes, it is important. If it was not important, it would not be specified in FCC rules. You are legally required to use what they call slash. You may not substitute whatever you want. It's illegal. Maybe that seems petty, but let's look at the history of amateur radio, which has been lost. Back in the 1920s, 10s, 20s, it was maybe not called amateur radio, but that's what it was. If you read the book 200 Meters and Down, the amateurs were ahead of the commercial broadcast entities, technically. Had bigger, better stations, higher power, longer ranges, better antennas. And to get right to the key point, there was no military communication. Burn that phrase into your brain, because that's what amateur radio is all about, believe it or not. Back in the day, according to that book and other sources, radio amateurs were the people that developed military communications. Military communications is two parts: equipment, antennas and such, and operating procedures. The word communications is critical. It means communicating information. Amateur radio is not a communications radio service. It is engineering and technical. That's a critical distinction. Every other service is for communications. We're not. Fast forwarding to today, we have all this fancy digital equipment, and the purpose and the scope of amateur radio has been lost. Field day, for example. I don't operate field day anymore. It's become perverted. Its purpose is lost. It is falsely seen by amateurs as a contest. Field day is not a contest. It is an emergency preparedness exercise. The exercise is setting up a station, getting on the air. There's no such thing as field day contest. Technically speaking, contesting is against FCC regulations. It serves no amateur radio technical purpose whatsoever, and it wastes spectrum and causes interference. But I digress. Why I'm hammering on call signs and separators and things like that is that there are a set of regulations by law that are kind of, to make a crude example, the difference between these regulations, which regulate our frequencies, power levels, call signs, identification procedures, and all that are before and separate to getting on the air and then talking about something. It isn't regulated what we talk about, except it should be technical nature, and regulations specifically say we must make remarks of a personal nature, no business. That's where the pecuniary rule comes in, no money making. But for a crude example, these procedures and these FCC regulations are kind of like going through a formal service at church, and then afterward going to potluck and sitting around and talking about, we might talk about church or the weather or whatever. There's, it's kind of like the rules and procedures for getting an airplane off the ground. Very strict, formal, regulated by law, set down by history, procedures for getting an aircraft on a runway, taxied and up in the sky. Once you're in the sky, fly around, just stay in your flight zone, stay in your altitude, and then you can fly and look around the countryside. But you got to get through the formal stuff first. The reason that these things are so critical in amateur radio is that we are given the greatest latitude of anybody I know of, except maybe some military operations, for doing radio experimentation on the air live internationally. That is a mind-boggling privilege. Nobody else does that I know of. Amateur radio is an experimenter's and an engineering and technical radio service. It's not for communications. And since we have extremely great permission and latitude, to experiment on the air were given certain frequency bands and power limits to reduce the chance of interference. What is hiding in the background and off to the side is this link that amateur radio has with military historically. It's a mistake to think that military is the big brother. It isn't. Amateur radio is. We came first. We invented military communications and equipment. And while we might see big military installations and high power and airplanes zooming around, we are historically the bigger twin brother. And as such, it's a very great responsibility. Also noting that back in the day, especially the thing with Mars, military amateur radio, that's where the two came together. But here's some important concepts to remember when you think about amateur radio. In the U.S., as an amateur radio licensee, you are 2 steps down an organizational chart from the United States Senate, literally. The United States Senate appoints the commissioner of the FCC, and we're licensed under the FCC. Now, as citizens, we're on top of the heap. We own the system. But in an org chart view, we're 2 steps down the ladder. That is an immense privilege. Historically, in amateur radio, rules like the slant, call sign, calling KBYP mobile 0, these things were not optional. These things were required. And even before I could have gone mobile, I had to get permission and coordination with I think it was called a frequency coordinator at FCC, to essentially get permission to operate mobile. There was something different back then that doesn't so much exist now. But this was done by strict regulation, and there were FCC monitors on the air listening. And back in the day, we didn't dare cross them. We minded our P's and Q's, and we kept things nice and tight. Otherwise, we could literally get a knock on the door from the white van. Much of these regulations are still in place in Part 97. The frequency coordination thing has basically been reduced down to don't operate in radio quiet zones near military or astronomy installations. We can't go park near a radio astronomy observatory site and operate, because they're looking for signals that are over 200 dB down. They can't have interference. There are rules about that kind of thing. But what ties this all together is the unstated observation from history that not only were we superior to military, but we are still effectively part of military communications, whether you know it or not. And whether you know it or not, they're listening. I guarantee it. They use us for beacons. They use our transmitters for propagation beacons to check propagation. Notice, get the FCC frequency spectrum chart, not the amateur, but the entire spectrum, and look at where the military frequencies are and look where ours are. And in the case of 60 and 30 meters, they're right on top of each other. When you get on the air, you may not have a clue as to how very important that is. And being that we in the U.S. own this system, it is a duty on us to do it right and keep it clean. We don't need to crap in our own backyards. But I assure you, they are listening. And this was evident in a small way a week or so ago with the split frequency military amateur contacts, the NSS and such. I worked a couple of them. I don't generally do trivial things like that, just making contacts for the sake of making contacts, except for DX, which is a significant technical exercise. But that's a different matter. That's very important to work those stations. But that just very vaguely hints what's going on in the background, and we don't see it. But it is there. Understand that amateur radio has almost completely lost any ability to do its purpose of handling message traffic. 99.9% of the hams on the air today are absolutely unqualified to do that, especially in an emergency. If that ever happens, those of us that get on the air that can operate properly are going to be very obvious. And those that aren't are going to be obvious. And those that aren't are going to be encouraged to go away because they won't know what to do. But when the S really hits the fan, cell phones go down, like in the Gatlinburg disaster in Tennessee. When the state's fancy digital system, millions and millions of dollars went down like a French maid, there was nothing left except amateur radio, and they didn't use it. Well, on the flip side, considering that very few amateurs are qualified to do that, I can see the point. I wouldn't use us either. Now, if you want to hear the way it should be, get on 7290 and listen to Texas Traffic Net, or a bit further down the 40-meter band, there's a group that gets on and handles practice traffic, and they do it right. They score and check each other against traffic handling rules. They do it by the book, and that's what it's got to be when the crap really hits the fan. When the crap hits the fan and it's emergency time, there's none of this Roger Roger or QRZ crap. There's none of this stroke crap. There's none of this talking about the weather crap. It's on. And it's got to be done correctly, because it is critical to do so for clarity of communications, especially in horrible band conditions. And that's another part of the fact that we have such a wide frequency range to work with, like the military does. No other radio service that I know of has that ability. That's another subtle hint that we're basically part of the military communications world, and vice versa. But if and when all that fails, we're what's left. And that is an awesome responsibility. And we got to be ready, and we got to be trained and experienced. And none of that training and experience is causing splatter and distortion by using a power mic and an equalizer. Those people can't communicate now without an amplifier. When the crap hits the fan and there's no power for an amplifier, all of them are immediately out. I can talk to Europe on a daily basis with a car battery. I've handled emergency traffic. I know how to do it for real. And I have spent my time optimizing antennas instead of playing with microphone amplifiers. Heck, I can talk to Europe QRP on a decent day lately. But I've focused on the technical aspects as we're supposed to. But again, this amateur radio is just not a more advanced version of CB radio. This is serious business, and it's still regulated. And FCC can come out of hiding and slap us down if we need it. So beware and act like they're always listening, because they might be. But again, all these operating procedures that are being lost, like we don't call QRZ, we call CQ, because everybody knows what that means. That's how it's been done historically. And we're required, or at least suggested by regulations, to observe good amateur practice. And that's the whole thing, and that's historical. And these practices have been refined over the years. For example, using military phonetics, because they're the easiest to understand in poor conditions and noisy conditions. They're the best for what communication is necessary. But this is not fun and games, and not something trivial. This is an extreme privilege of what we do, and there's a lot of responsibility here. And we got to keep up our end of the bargain, because it's our system. It doesn't behoove us to trash it like is happening on the air. And this is why it's obvious to us older operators that these people saying we need to do this and that, or FCC will close down the amateur spectrum, these people are clueless. There is zero chance that's going to happen. And now you know why. Because we're beacons for military purposes. So keep that in mind when you're operating on the air. KBYP out.